Well, we're very fortunate today to have Mayor Burt. Pat has had quite a week, and this is being taped on Friday, so this comes after the State of the City address on Wednesday night and after a long City Council meeting on Tuesday afternoon and a long one on Monday night. So thank you for taking the time to be here. I was struck at having gone back and looked at the video of your State of the City address in 2010 when you were mayor before, at the similarities and the differences between the two speeches, both the historical moment in which they were being given and sort of the tone and setting also. I wonder if that struck you and just how you would contrast the two speeches.
Well, I think back in 2010, that talk was in the midst of the Great Recession, and it tried to really focus on the real present challenges that we had and those that were on the near-term horizon. And frankly, they were somewhat different challenges than we face today. We've really moved into a different era, and we also, you know, we've been having a lot of events down at the Mitchell Park Community Center, and it's just a fantastic venue. It's warm, it's engaging with the community, it's less formal, and it really facilitates, I think, a greater interaction. I mean, we had that afternoon, we had a Project Safety Net meeting down there, and they said, oh, it was going to be at Lucy Stern. We said, no, let's just have it down there so that we can have this continuum of people who are at that location. Frankly, I think that community center has become more of a community treasure than even was hoped for.
That's great.
And I feel like the beginning of the speech in some ways highlighted the contrast, because you started by kind of going over the recent infrastructure projects. You know, there's obviously the new library and community center, there's the pothole repairs, and there's the El Camino Park and all that stuff, which obviously you couldn't have talked about in 2010 because it kind of wasn't happening. And I'm guessing those kind of one of the big themes, kind of at least in the early part of the speech, the fact that the city's doing really well now financially. But you also talked about some of the challenges when it comes to the fiscal aspect. So what are some of the biggest challenges right now that you see on the horizon when it comes to the finances?
Well, we're seeing our costs go up, and frankly, it's the sort of thing that we saw back in the dot-com boom and right before the Great Recession, where we're seeing difficulty recruiting and retaining employees, including in essential services and police and fire and utilities. And it's really the booming cost of living that is going on here, and the very low unemployment rate that's creating new pressure again on our ongoing operating budget. And then, as I mentioned last night, we have one remaining long-term element to our sustainable finances, and that is to begin to pay down the unfunded pension liability.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to jump right into the key, what I thought was the major theme of your comments Wednesday night, having to do with this sort of dual struggle, the tension, if you will, between the need to address transportation and traffic congestion problems, which extend to parking issues, but at the same time, this sense that we need to be building more housing. And you made the comment in your speech that you felt optimistic, I guess is probably the best word to use, that we could actually create more housing opportunities in the community and at the same time reduce traffic. Can you expand a little bit on that and share with us?
Well, first, we already have an obligation to zone, and zoning in a meaningful way, for around 2,000 housing units in the next 7 years. The 7-year period that we're in the midst of. This is our regional housing mandate passed down from the state through the Association of Bay Area Governments. So we're already obligated to do that to a great degree. We've had discussions for the last year and a half about moving these housing locations more toward the downtown areas, University, Cal Ave, along El Camino, and places that have fewer impacts, and we've also had preliminary discussions, but haven't yet moved on them, on the sorts of housing units that would address some of the concerns that we've had and problems that we've had in the past when we had housing that was overwhelmingly for additional families and had a major impact on our schools. Now we really are starting to concentrate on housing that is for young professionals, smaller units, and for retirees. So those have fewer impacts on schools. They have fewer impacts on trip generation, in particular if we put them in the right locations and the right types. But I think that the community's willingness to consider how much housing we consider is very dependent on whether we actually address the traffic and congestion issues, not whether we offer theories and promises.
Well, right now it sounds a lot like theories and promises. So what order do we do this in? And how do we actually demonstrate to the community that we can reduce traffic? And do we do that before or after you move forward on the housing front?
Well, we're already obligated to move forward to some degree on the housing. We had, when we submitted our housing element, we at the same time as the city said we would follow up with relocating some of those housing sites. We haven't acted on it, so we already have that obligation there.
Well, and just to be clear, the obligation, as I understand it, was that the housing element needed to designate that many housing units. It doesn't require you to actually do anything.
It has to not just designate them, it has to zone for them in a way that in order to have our housing element certified by the state, which is the requirement, we don't just get to create one.
Right.
They have to be sites that are designed to be able to be built, and that they're zoned and have a likelihood of being built. So it's not just a matter of designating.
Is there anything that you think the city could do besides zoning? Because as you mentioned, and as Bill just mentioned, zoning requirement doesn't necessarily mean that these things will actually come online. And in the meantime, as you saw on Monday, there's quite a few people who are really stressed out about getting priced out of Palo Alto. So is there anything like funding incentives or any kind of new programs that you think the city should do in addition to just zoning the sites for housing?
Well, I think there's more that can be done through a variety of city actions, including zoning, than many people realize. If you look at what we did when Hyatt Ricky's closed over a decade ago, the consensus was, woe is us, we're never going to get a replacement hotel in this city to replace the big revenue lost from a big hotel. And at the time, I argued otherwise. And I said, look, we have a great hotel destination for business and recreation, but we have no marketing and no incentives. Basically, hotels are, as much as they may be good earners for those who operate them, for investors, they are generally the lowest return on investment under a normal zoning. And what we ended up doing was not only engaging in a marketing program that the hotels ended up taking over themselves, but we changed the zoning. And we increased the floor area ratio allowed for hotels. We may need to come back and readjust that, but we have had huge success in adding to that. And our revenue from hotels has gone from a low of close to $5 million to $20 million. And that matters hugely in our ability to address the infrastructure. In the downtown area, we've already done a great deal of what we need to do, because we could increase or incentivize for housing downtown, and if office buildings are still a better financial return for investors, they won't take a good investment if there's a better investment. Mm-hmm. And by putting in place the office cap, which is not a beauty contest, it is a competition for quality, and limiting the amount of office that can be built in our two downtowns in El Camino area, and eliminating a bunch of the ways in which office development was able to avoid putting in the parking that was necessary, and also the overall office cap for downtown, and restricting transfer of development rights. We have largely curtailed the real rush and high financial returns for building office downtown. There aren't the opportunities nor as great of incentives. then
But
if
we're not seeing housing come as a result.
that's half of the equation. So the first half of the equation was what we've already done. And people didn't quite realize, and we haven't had an opportunity to really discuss it this way, but we will in the coming weeks, and I'll be talking more along these very lines, is that half of the equation is to make office development less lucrative or less available, and the other half is to look at how to make housing development more attractive. If we merely made housing more attractive or for developers, I don't think it would get built as long as building offices more yet lucrative.
So just to take the example of the Olive Garden restaurant site, which has a proposal that will come before you and compete in the beauty contest, that proposal has in it a handful of housing units. It has commercial office space and it has some retail. That is, I assume, not what we're really looking for.
Correct.
For that site.
Better than what we were getting before,
right?
And not as good as we want.
So how do we? Is it in your mind through this competition that we're going to persuade the owners of that property to overhaul that plan and make it a much more heavily small unit housing plan?
Well,
how are we going to get what we're talking about if a very large parcel that's going to take up a big chunk of your competition square footage, your cap square footage, results in sort of not a game changer in terms of what it turns out to be?
Well, it only takes up a good chunk of that if it wins the competition.
Right, right.
So those who don't win the competition or see that there's going to be a real limitation on that, for one, they will, if they don't have the office alternative, they will look at other options. Now, the other direction that we would potentially be going is what additional zoning changes that, in essence, function as zoning incentives. They're not necessarily city dollars that we can offer millions and millions of dollars to every potential housing development. So just as we did with the hotels, we can look at different aspects. For instance, in the downtown area, and I think on the horizon in the Cal Ave area, as we implement residential permit parking, we have the ability to do something we never could before. If in the past we had arguments, and they're reasonable arguments, that there would be less trip generation and fewer vehicles owned with smaller units near transit and near downtown services. But we've always been hesitant to allow them to put in less parking, even for residential, because we said, well, what's the guarantee that they're not just going to flow over into the neighborhood? But if we put in place, not only for commercial, but for the residential, that they're ineligible for residential permit parking, then whatever developer comes along has to have a high confidence that they will have the measures in place that will allow them to be able to sell or rent those apartments without it being, the value of them being discounted because they don't have enough parking. And there are measures that can do that.
Since we did switch gears a little bit to cars, I did want to kind of get to that topic because it was such a big part of the speech. And as we've seen from citizen surveys, it's one of the biggest concerns in the city right now. As you talked about in your speech, the city has been pursuing a downtown TMA, Transportation Management Agency, which is a new nonprofit that I guess just actually became a nonprofit last month, aimed to reduce car trips. But I was interested to learn, like both from your speech and from the meeting earlier in the week, that Stanford Research Park is pursuing its own kind of separate TMA. Is there anything you could tell us about how that's going and where that is in the process? And basically,
I met with them a couple weeks ago and got an update because I was very interested in hearing how much progress. I had heard just generalizations from them that they were really making great progress, and I didn't know what that meant. And I was surprised really by two things. One is they're going gangbusters. And I think when we see we have study sessions coming up on March 14th on both our Transportation Management Agency, the Stanford Research Park, and then a discussion around our other transportation initiatives, because not everything the city's doing is in this TMA that we're doing for downtown. And from hearing from the Research Park, they've already struck an agreement with the Valley Transit Authority, the VTA, for something that I had been pushing on for 2.5 years, which is looking at how we could have VTA redefine what constitutes a business entity for purposes of getting the lowest cost, what they call their eco pass. You know, we have our go passes for Caltrain, which are hugely successful, but very few people know that if you have 1,500 employees, it's $1.50 a month per employee, $18 a year for unlimited bus travel in the county. And people generally, because we don't use it very much, don't know that we have VTA buses on El Camino every few minutes. It's really an extensive bus service, but it's created by VTA principally to serve South County coming to here and up and down El Camino. We don't think of it as a local transit service. And we haven't had it supplied to all of the service workers that are within reasonable distance of El Camino up and down the county between here and San Jose and who work here. So they have already struck this deal, and VTA agreed to let the research park act as a group and get that rate. And they've got the dozen or so largest employers in the research park already signed up. So out of, they thought 26,000 employees in the research park, we think it's something like 28,000. Anyway, they already have 14,000 eco passes that are going into employee hands within the coming weeks. Plus, they are expanding previously they had, we have all these regional buses that come from San Francisco and things, and a bunch of those companies had their own buses. They've consolidated it, and they have actually, Stanford hired a transportation management coordinator for this agency who's doing a great job, and they're now combining on buses for the whole research park. They also want to expand the whole Marguerite shuttle system to function as a combined shuttle system in the research park, and if we can get better coverage of Caltrain or service of Caltrain here, they want to have shuttle buses going back and forth down to the Caltrain station. And they have a real great high-tech app that they're rolling out, I think, in April, that is going to be all the ride sharing for thousands of people in the research park. They smartly are waiting.
So Pat, where does that leave the employees and employers of small companies, the restaurants that have service employees? What's the rationale behind not giving those VTA rates to smaller employers?
There isn't a rationale behind not giving them rates. But what we have
got to have 1,500 employees to get that deal.
That's right. And
that makes no sense.
Well, we can do that. Now that Stanford Research Park struck the agreement with the VTA, that's the agreement that I had been asking our staff to pursue with VTA for over 2 years. We have a downtown business district, improvement district, that is a similar entity to what this research park is. So as soon as we have a funding mechanism, we can get that sort of deal, I believe, for all of those service workers in restaurants and service industries. That's the notion. That was actually the notion when I proposed it 2 years ago, was to serve those folks who I think will ride those buses more than the Stanford Research Park.
Oh, really? See, that would kind of surprise me just based on those TMA surveys that suggested that service workers often have weird hours, that multiple jobs. So it seems like that's almost like the hardest people to reach, even with incentives to take buses. But I guess
it's not a one-size-fits-all. So you're not going to, and people keep going around in a circle this way, saying, well, if you're not going to solve the entirety of a problem with this one solution, it must not be a good solution. And it's not a question of whether all service workers will use this. It's whether a good number will. I think they will. I want to see the survey data of this. I think they will. But then you also have things that go complement, whether it's the Caltrain Go Pass or this Eco Pass, is that you're right that there are times where workers need to 1 day a week be able to drive to work, or they need to be able to, once they get to work, they have an errand, that they have a doctor's appointment or whatever. And that's where things like zip cars and shared cars are the complement to that, where they can go, I just go out and I use the Palo Alto weekly zip car down in your parking lot, and any employee who has to run an errand during the day can do that, and then those employees say, okay, well, the other 4 days I'm okay taking the train.
And there's another mode of transportation that you talked about that's not buses and cars, and that's bicycles. And as Vice Mayor Shar said in his introductions, you ride the ride. In fact, you rode your bike here to this interview. You talked quite a bit about the Safe Routes to School program, which has been like a real leader with 45% of high school students now biking. What is the vision for expanding it to non-schools?
Well, we're already rolling that out. We've been for the last week. Frankly, it was 4 years ago. Our city manager said he wanted us to proceed on a new bike master plan. Mm-hmm. And as the strongest bike advocate on the council, my first reaction was no. And people kind of said, why? And my answer was, well, we didn't do anything with our last one. Why do we need a new plan if we're not going to put any dollars and be serious about implementing it? And the city manager said, no, I'm serious about it, and I want us to pursue a comprehensive plan that we're really going to be committed to. Mm-hmm. And that's already happened. I mean, we have up and down the city all kinds of new bike expansions that are going on, and this plan that we're doing right now, once it's complete in, I think it'll be about 3 years before we've done the bulk of what's in that, we'll see a whole step up that we haven't seen, frankly, since the 70s in Palo Alto, where we put in bike lanes, lots of places. You look at roads like Lewis and half of Cal Ave, and there's no parking on one side of the street. That wasn't always the case. That came about because in the 60s and 70s, when we first put in one of the best biking programs at that time in the country, we made a bunch of those changes. We're now doing the next generation group of them, and we'll see how much that expands biking in the community and whether we then go on to a third generation.
I want to go back briefly to your mentioning of the Marguerite service, Stanford's bus service. In your speech, you made reference to that in connection with the expansion of the Palo Alto shuttle program and just neighborhood transportation, public transportation. Are you opening the door, or do you feel like there's a possibility that we could get the Marguerite better integrated and even perhaps contract with the Marguerite service to provide our shuttle service? Because I know an attempt was made at that and it didn't get past
Well, I don't know
square
how much
one.
of an attempt. So I reached out to Stanford recently in the context of their research park TMA and spoke about this issue, that we're seeing more and more Marguerite buses go to more areas of the community. Most of the community doesn't know that they can get on them. Mm-hmm. Stanford doesn't broadcast their service stops to folks outside of their employee or student base. But they're there and they're stopping. They
come down Embarcadero Road.
Oh, I don't know the numbers, but I suspect for local shuttle bus trips in Palo Alto, not on Stanford campus, that the Marguerite Stanford system may have 10 times the service of our local shuttle system right now. And it's available to our community. So I've talked with Stanford about that when we met on their TMA from the research park, and they're open to further discussions on this. And frankly, one of the challenges I placed to them was, we now hear from you that you're viewing transportation issues and your employers in the research park are viewing them as big of a problem as we as residents view them. And so once we start with that kind of agreement, I said, well, why don't we cooperate more? And Stanford ended up saying, okay, we're open to it. Let's proceed on those discussions on a range of issues, not just the Marguerite, whether it is having both systems and they're in closer collaboration, or whether Stanford, which has just an amazing shuttle system, ends up subsuming what we do.
Do you think that's on the table? I mean, that's
various discussions are, I think, going to be on the table.
And I think to some extent, Stanford already kind of committed it, because they're about to add 2,000 beds to the Escondido Village area, and one of the mitigations for that project is an expansion of Marguerite shuttle. They talked about the fact that it's going to be going to like the Cumberly area, all sorts of kind of routes. So even without the city necessarily kind of getting them to do that, they're already kind of doing it. And they also kind of mentioned it is open to the public, though they weren't as loud about mentioning as you were on Wednesday.
Before we get onto some other topics, I wanted to not lose the parking issue in the downtown area. This has been a busy week in terms of that. And that whole system is going to get more complicated before it gets simpler. You've created now a bunch of downtown parking zones that permits will be issued for in the neighborhoods. You've expanded now by a few blocks outward. You've got some pretty upset businesses and some pretty upset neighbors. How do we reduce the tension and the conflict between those two groups? Do you feel like this next phase is going to achieve that, or are we in for some rough waters?
Well, first I need to remind you that because the annexed boundaries, the expanded boundaries of the residential permit parking zones, one of them went 490 feet from my home, and if you're within 500 feet under state law,
you
I'm
can't
recused.
participate.
So I didn't draw the good straw, and
Right.
I was recused from that. So I got to observe. I can participate in the future if we go back and have broader policy discussions around citywide residential permit parking, but the specific downtown ones, unfortunately, I can't participate in directly. I will say that from what I observed in the discussions, one of the things that was clear that we only sold 1,600 commercial or commercial
Business permits, yeah.
business permits in the first phase, and we are allowing for 2,000. There was a concern by the business community that we would then begin a process of gradually stepping down those permits by 10% per year. But it appears that we may have a fudge factor already to start off that will allow some adjustment in the first year or two without having created much of a crisis, while we begin to actually get those businesses to take measures to reduce their car trips, and while we as a city take measures to support that.
How do the plans for building a new downtown garage fit in with the city's plans to reduce car trips?
So first, I think if we had at one time looked at the need for 2 garages and under an assumption that wouldn't solve the problem. And what we're now seeing is that no, we've pretty much said a second garage is, for the time being at least, and probably for the long term, off the table. And then the second question is that other garage still of value to build? And I don't think that anyone is any longer thinking that we want to build a garage to accommodate more cars that will be coming downtown in the future. The building of the garage would be able to accommodate a portion of the cars that there is no space for in the downtown and who are now spilling over into the neighborhoods. And that we would take that 1,600 permits, and some of them, a couple hundred, would be able to purchase parking permits in the garage, and the balance have to come from reducing car trips. So it's a complementary measure. And then there's the question of, when we see this long-term trends, if we, for instance, are able to achieve what is already the City Council goal of reducing the downtown single occupancy vehicle car trips by 30%, and if we do that over a decade, the data showed that we won't need to sell any residential permits within about 7 years, and we'll begin to start needing less parking downtown if we hit that full achievement. So then people would go, well, why build a garage? Well, we have a lot of surface parking land downtown that has real value, and frankly, surface parking lots in the midst of land that is worth tens of $millions an acre is probably not the highest and best use of land. So it will enable us to look at other alternatives if we elect to go forward with that garage, which is still a council decision to do it. But that's, I think, the reasoning, and that it's not contradictory to our other efforts, but it is something that we have to look in that longer term context, which is part of why last night I wanted to move us beyond just the short-term issues in front of our faces and look at how those tied in to our longer-term issues. And that's a good example of it.
Well, speaking of longer-term issues, should we switch gears to the comprehensive plan? How exhausting is that? I mean, you guys have been
10 years now.
Yeah, since
2006 we started.
Well,
although it's been
It's had a few stops and starts.
But
it was redefined as to what we were doing. And when it started, it was to be a relatively
Don't give us
minor
the whole
update.
history of it.
All right.
We don't have time for that.
It as 10 years is the same thing. Okay.
10 years ago, the council decided that it's time to update the plan.
Update.
Required by law.
Yeah. And since then, there's been a few years of not much happening, and now there's a lot happening. That's kind of the short story.
Great.
Well, and at the midpoint, it switched from a minor update to say, no, we want to do a full redo.
Yeah, how much do we regret that decision?
I don't regret it.
Go ahead and ask your question.
Well, I was just curious. Right now, it seems like there's a new process in place in which there's like a 23-member citizen group, and of course, there's 9 council people, and it seems like it's a really
planning commission.
And planning commission, yeah, and it seems like it's a really kind of difficult, almost messy process to come to a consensus among so many people on something so broad and so comprehensive. How do you do it?
Well, we did it. We did it in the
possible?
mid-'90s. When we had a comprehensive plan advisory committee. What do we have? 30 people.
At least.
And some very significant subcommittees. And that comprehensive plan moved us from the prior plan had moved us into a kind of a strict residentialist perspective, in the sense that we had kind of, in that period had taken permissible uses of commercial in areas near residential, and we essentially we did things like eliminating mom and pop stores in neighborhoods. And then by the mid to late 90s, as we were redoing the comp plan, part of the progressive thinking was, well, what you really want to do is have things like commercial services and mom and pop stores in neighborhoods. And how do you get them after you've already lost them? Nobody wants to have a mom and pop store next door after you have lost it. But that kind of vision of realizing that driving everywhere, getting in your car and driving to everything that you wanted to do was not a very progressive vision. And we moved one toward more in the direction of a walkable, rideable community that was pedestrian oriented, where we really focused on neighborhood shopping centers and how we'd try to revitalize those. None of these things easy tasks, but it was a different vision. And now we're moving on what is, almost 20 years later, really, well, it is 20 years later, really thinking about what's the vision for the next 20 years. This is an important task. Yes, everybody can say, oh, gee, it takes a long time and all that. I actually think we're starting to see some real progress. I tried to push for a year or two before we finally got support for it to go in this direction, to do it right, take a step back and do it right. And staff was apprehensive about taking on that additional project, and I'm going, I don't see us solving these problems unless we really go about it in this way that is inclusive.
And you don't think we're going to end up with a plan similar to the current plan, where anybody advocating anything can point to the policies in the plan that support that point of view, which is really very much what we have now?
I don't think that's principally what we do have now. I think that we have a plan that has certain tensions that were acknowledged at the time the plan was adopted, and that those were natural and deliberate tensions. It's not much different from the ways that we will, different people will argue our Constitution and interpretations of a Constitution. It doesn't make it meaningless. It means that we have a framework in which we should be guided in our policy decisions, and that the problem, I don't think, has been too much reference to the comp plan. I think it's been too little.
But when 27 University came up, and both sides of that project pointed to the comprehensive plan as the reasons to support their position, that's not a good plan. It's not a good plan when we have something as dramatic as that project was, and it's defended by the use of the comprehensive plan. And we don't want to debate the 27 University.
Okay, but let me just say, just as in the Constitution, we get specious arguments, less strong arguments, and we get stronger arguments. In the end, I think that returning us to looking at the comp plan in the breadth of the policies and programs that were relevant to that are part of why we recognize that it was the wrong thing to do. Once again, I think we spent too little of our focus, and we drifted away from really thinking about it in the context of the comp plan. Yes, people can make
it helps
an
if you have zoning in place that resolves those issues ahead of time, which is what we don't.
That's right.
Which we haven't done a great job at.
And the city council is now really into the nitty-gritty of editing each element or each chapter. And the first one came like a week or two ago, and what ended up happening is there was all this work that the advisory commission did, and you guys took some issues and you said it was too long, too many commas, some of the policies were redundant, others not exactly what we want. So it's going back for another round of talks. So I imagine this is going to either extend the timeline or just require the CAC to have more meetings. Okay, so if this is something that's going to happen for future chapters, and I can't imagine land use and transportation not having kind of a lot of debate on both sides, do you still have any confidence that this could be adopted by next May, as is the current timeline? And do you care that if it's adopted next May, or if it's going to stretch till 2018, or?
Well, I would prefer that it's adopted on time. I think the most important thing is that it be done right. What we had on that, the element that you just referred to, staff and the Community Advisory Committee both said this is the first chapter that we're going to go through this process on, and we want to learn out of that. And everybody walked away and said, okay, this was a little rough going through it, some things that we hadn't fully anticipated, but we did learn from it. And I expect that the subsequent chapters will fold that into it. So I think we will get better at the process as we go into the next chapters, but it's imperfect. I mean, this is making sausage.
I want to ask you a couple of quick questions about the police department. You just paid $250,000 to a nearby resident to settle a lawsuit against the city, and I assume there was additional dollars added by the other defendants. Was the full settlement more than $250,000?
Not to my knowledge.
Okay, Palo Alto was paying $250,000 though, so there were other defendants, the county, because of the treatment at the jail and so forth. But that being what it is. That's a lot of money, and that's not a nuisance settlement. And I'm wondering what lessons have been learned from that particular case. And for our viewers that may not be familiar, this was a Los Altos Hills resident who was arrested as a passenger in a car, and basically, without getting into too many details, he suffered some injuries, alleged excessive force. And the city settled right after having lost a motion about access to the information about whether the video cameras were operational, and if not, why not, and an inquiry into that. So a lot of questions have been raised about that incident. I wonder if you can shed any light on that for us.
Well, cities get sued frequently.
Of course.
And in every circumstance, we rely on the city attorney to give us guidance on the most prudent course of action. Within this case, to the extent that I'm familiar with the details and to the extent that I can talk about those, we had malfunctioning of our police recording devices.
On two different cars, as I understand it.
No.
No?
No.
Okay.
No, one simply wasn't in a position to capture.
Okay, good.
And when that incident actually happened, our police department was already in the process of bidding to have next generation, higher reliability and more information from these recording devices. And they had been having some problems, and they were out to bid to replace them. We think that not having those recordings were a disadvantage on defending ourselves. And that as a result, the city attorney thought the most prudent thing to do was to settle for this amount, which was not what the defendants were seeking, and it wasn't what the city would have preferred the settlement ground. It's a negotiated settlement. Mm-hmm. So I think that we as a city think that having better and more reliable information from what our police are wearing and is on their vehicles is valuable, and we already have that. And that had already been in the works and is implemented before now.
So the Christmas morning or evening officer-involved shooting that led to a fatality, this issue has arisen in certain ways around that, because the city has thus far opted to not release the multiple video camera views of that incident. Why is that?
My understanding, and I'm not in the middle of this, is that in these a fatality like this, the district attorney's office evaluates it, and those materials are turned over to them, and it's not appropriate for us to be going about releasing them. They will come be released when the district attorney determines. That's
well, when you say not appropriate, you don't mean that you're not allowed to.
Well, I just don't know all the particulars of that. My understanding is that it's in the hands of the district attorney's office. We've turned all those over to them, and that we have, as a result of what I was just describing, we now have much more comprehensive recording information, and that we think that's a good thing. We think
in this climate nationwide, obviously, there are police departments that have policies and practices of very quickly moving to release videos of this nature because they want to build trust in the community and show that there's nothing to hide and not raise any questions about their behavior. So I think the law doesn't certainly preclude the city of Palo Alto from doing that. And it's not at all clear whether those videos will ever be released, apparently.
Okay.
So we'll have to wait and see.
Evidently, you know more than me.
Before we run out of time here, I'm interested in knowing if there's any one thing or two things that by the time you're out of office, which will coincide with giving up the mayorship at the end of this year, you want to be sure and try to accomplish.
Well, we didn't really talk about what was the primary theme of my State of the City address, which is to try to look at the range of near-term issues and how we can begin to integrate them with our long-term planning and how, frankly, they can be integrated. So I think the most important thing is not a laundry list of my personal pet peeves or mayor's initiatives. It's whether we as a city are moving in a really meaningful direction toward a long-term, not only vision, but set of plans. So we have our comprehensive plan, and we have our sustainability and climate action plan. And those two documents really address things in similar ways, because the very things that contribute to the quality of life of the community are also ones that basically make it a more sustainable community. And then sustainability means that we're not going to have a degradation of our quality of life as we pass on our community to our children and their children. So these two things are really integrated. And for me, that's the most meaningful thing. I want to see us on a path as a community that as we look 1, 2, and more decades down the road, we're going to have a community that is at least as good of a quality of life as we have today. And frankly, from the traffic and transportation issues, better than what we have today.
So as you leave office at the end of the year, there's going to be a lot of undone things, obviously. I mean, most of what we've talked about today and what you talked about in your speech are things that are going to be, as you point out.
You mean the work is not going to end?
The work is not going to get done.
At the end of 2011 or 2016?
Do you have thoughts as to how you're going to contribute to how your public service is going to continue after the end of the year? What plans do you have to?
No.
You just want to get through this year.
I don't have plans. And I generally don't try to plan too far ahead. So the answer is no, I don't have plans.
It's
might take a
after
breather.
2030.
Huh?
You just plan as far ahead as 2030.
Yeah, well, that's not my plans. That's the city's. But might take a bit of a breather. I've got big commitments on the company I'm involved with, and we'll be spending even more time on that. And I wouldn't mind taking 1 or 2 vacations once in a while.
And no school board races in your future,
None of my plans.
Okay.
No.
Quite a few bike rides.
Yeah.
Well, Mayor Pat Burt, thanks very much for being with us.
Great, thanks.
Good to see you.
Okay.
That's it for today. Thanks for tuning in. To keep up on the news, go to paloaltoonline.com, and we'll see you next week.